Have you ever dedicated years of your life to something you deeply believed in, and then it all fell apart? This is the story of David, a man who worked tirelessly for a decade without missing a single day, only to be let go without so much as a thank you. It seems unfair, doesn't it? But this isn't just a story of pain and disappointment. It's a journey of overcoming, forgiveness, and rediscovery. Today, I want to invite you to dive into this powerful story, because I know many of us have experienced moments when the world seemed to fall on our shoulders. Maybe you were betrayed, ignored, or undervalued. Maybe you felt like your efforts were worthless. If you've ever asked yourself, is it worth it to keep going? Then this video is for you. Before we continue, I want to ask you something simple. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. This is where we share real stories like Jose's to inspire, comfort, and transform lives. And if this message touches your heart, share it with someone special, because we all need hope in difficult times. Now get ready to follow this moving journey. A story that will make you reflect on the true meaning of purpose, gratitude, and justice. It was a cold October morning, the kind that seems to foretell something big in the air. David woke up before the alarm clock went off, his heart beating faster than usual. He had dreamed of that moment so many times that, when he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized the man reflected there. He was no longer the insecure young man who had sent resumes to dozens of companies. Today, he would be someone new, a dedicated employee, ready to build his future with his own hands. He still remembered his mother's words. Decent work ennobles the soul. Those words echoed within him as he adjusted his tie for the first time. As he entered that imposing building, David felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Each step in the hallway seemed to resonate like a silent commitment to himself. He promised that morning that he would not only do his job well, but that he would also leave his mark. From the beginning, he knew it wouldn't be easy. There were colleagues who already seemed worn out, others who complained about the heavy routine. But Jose decided he wouldn't be like them. He wanted to be different, someone everyone could trust. The first few months were challenging. The tasks were repetitive, and sometimes he wondered if it was really worth it. But whenever he thought about giving up, he remembered why he was there. His family was counting on him, and he couldn't fail. It was during a casual conversation with an older colleague that he learned something he would never forget. David, here, you can choose between two paths. Either you do it out of obligation, or you do it out of passion. Choose the right one, because that will define who you are. And that's exactly what he did. Jose chose to do it out of passion, but not everything was harmonious in that environment. Over time, he began to notice little things that bothered him. The praise for the newbies who arrived full of energy, while the veterans were treated as if they were invisible. The meetings where his ideas were ignored, even when they proved to be effective. Little by little, he realized that the corporate world was not as fair as he imagined. However, instead of becoming bitter, he decided to use this as fuel. And so, day after day, year after year, he kept going, without missing a single day. Until, 10 years later, something happened. Something that would change everything. David wasn't the type of person who liked the spotlight. He preferred to work behind the scenes with his head down and his hands firmly on the plow. Each project he delivered, each goal he achieved, was like a small brick he was putting into the construction of something bigger, even if no one around him seemed to notice. Sometimes he felt invisible. but that was never enough to discourage him. He knew that his dedication wasn't just for the paycheck at the end of the month. It was for something bigger, a deep sense of duty fulfilled. After all, work wasn't just an obligation for him, but a way of honoring everything his parents had sacrificed to give him a better life. But this journey wasn't without its costs. There were mornings when he woke up exhausted, with his body asking for a break, but his mind telling him there was no room for weakness. Do you remember that time when his daughter threw him a surprise party, decorating the entire house with colorful balloons? She was only 5 years old and wanted to celebrate his birthday. However, David barely got to enjoy the party because he had to go back to the office to finish an urgent report. As he drove to work, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the disappointed faces of his wife and daughter. At that moment, he promised himself that he would make up for this absence, even though he knew that others would come. His routine was marked by silent sacrifices. He would skip going to the doctor when he felt back pain, convinced that it would soon go away. He would put off vacations because he thought he would be seen as lazy or uncommitted. And little by little, these choices began to weigh on him. It wasn't just the overtime hours he had accumulated or the sleepless nights. It was the feeling that no matter how hard he gave it his all, something was still missing. The gratitude he expected to receive never came. And although he tried to push these thoughts away, they began to infiltrate his mind like small cracks in a wall. Deep down, Jose always believed that it would all be worth it. That, after 10 years of tireless work, he would finally be recognized. Maybe he would get a promotion. Maybe he would get a commemorative plaque. Maybe he would even get a simple thank you. But time passed, and none of that happened. Instead, he began to notice something strange about the environment. Something that would make him question whether all of his hard work was really worth it. Over time, David began to realize that this place wasn't quite what it seemed. In the early years, he tried to ignore the signs. Co-workers who would walk away after a few weeks of work. Bosses who treated employees like numbers on a spreadsheet. But now, a decade later, these small inconsistencies were beginning to add up to a clear and troubling picture. It was as if there was an invisible layer of ice between people, something that prevented any genuine connection. And through it all, Jose was still there, trying his best while feeling the weight of isolation grow. There were times when he was called into the manager's office with glowing promises. "David, you're doing a great job," they would say. "We just need to wait for the right moment and you'll get promoted." He heard these words so many times that they began to sound like a broken record. With each passing year, those promises were postponed with vague excuses. The company is going through adjustments. The board is still evaluating. And in the meantime, new employees arrived and quickly climbed positions that, in his opinion, should have been his. It was hard not to feel like he was being deceived, but Jose always tried to justify himself. "They know what they're doing. One day they'll see my worth." But the worst thing wasn't the empty promises, it was the indifference. That environment, which once seemed full of opportunities, turned out to be toxic. Endless meetings where the only thing that mattered was who shouted the loudest, colleagues who stabbed each other in the back in search of recognition. And in the midst of it all, Jose remained quiet, watching everything with a mixture of frustration and sadness. He tried to convince himself that his presence there had a greater purpose, but sometimes doubt whispered in his ear. Is it worth continuing to give so much of yourself to a company that doesn't see you? This feeling of emptiness began to slowly erode his motivation. He still went to work every day, still did his best, but something inside him had changed. It was as if he was walking in circles, never getting anywhere. And then, on a seemingly ordinary day, something happened. Something that would make David question everything he thought he knew about loyalty, work, and fairness. It was on a grey Monday that Jose met the man who would turn his world upside down. The new manager, Mr. Eduardo, arrived with a practiced smile and a firm handshake, but there was something in his eyes that conveyed a coldness that made David shiver. During the official presentation, Eduardo spoke about new guidelines, faster results, and resource optimization. To David, those words sounded like synonyms for cuts and excessive pressure. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a storm he never imagined he would face. From the first day, it was clear that Eduardo had little interest in people. He walked the halls like a general inspecting his troops, analyzing numbers and spreadsheets without ever asking how the teams were dealing with the increasing demands. In one meeting, David tried to share an idea that could improve internal processes, something he had been working on for months. But Eduardo barely looked at him, interrupting with a brief, "Let's focus on what really matters." At that moment, David felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Total invisibility. It was as if all his years of dedication had been erased with a simple gesture of indifference. As the weeks went by, changes began to appear. Employees were called to unexpected meetings and left them pale, some even crying. Rumors of layoffs began to circulate, but David couldn't believe that this could happen to him. After all, he was the exemplary employee, the one who never took a vacation, who was always present, who delivered results year after year. How could anyone ignore all of this? However, the more he tried to convince himself that he was safe, the more he realized that Eduardo saw everyone as nothing more than expendable pieces on a chessboard. And then came the blow. On a morning like any other, David was called to the meeting room. There was nothing extraordinary in the air, or at least that's what he thought. But when he entered the room, he realized that something was different. There was a heavy, almost palpable silence, and Eduardo's eyes seemed even colder than usual. It was there that Jose heard the words he would never forget, words that would change his life forever. David sat in that uncomfortable chair while Eduardo leafed through some papers as if he were reading something important. But David knew that it was just a show. He had already been to many meetings in that room and was well aware of the tricks used by managers to create an atmosphere of formality before delivering bad news. His heart was pounding, but he tried to remain calm, repeating to himself, "You are indispensable. You built this company with your own hands." However, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, something inside him already sensed the inevitable. And then came the sentence he never expected to hear. "David, unfortunately, we need to make some adjustments here at the company. Your position will be discontinued as of today." The words fell on him like a bucket of ice water. He could barely process what was happening. 10 years of uninterrupted dedication, 10 years of sacrifice, and now this. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to scream that this wasn't fair, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, all he could manage was a weak, "But why?" Eduardo replied in a distant, almost robotic tone. "Strategic decisions. It has nothing to do with your performance." That last sentence was the final straw. "It has nothing to do with your performance." What do you mean? Jose had given his all. sacrificed precious moments with his family, ignored physical and emotional pain, all for the sake of that company. And now they were saying that his departure had nothing to do with him. It was as if all his efforts had been reduced to dust in a matter of seconds. As he signed the termination papers, his hands were shaking. He couldn't look Eduardo in the eye because he knew he wouldn't find anything there. No humanity, no compassion, not even a hint of recognition for what he had done. When he left the room, David felt as if he were floating, disconnected from reality. He walked to his desk, gathered his things in silence while his colleagues pretended not to notice what was happening. Some even avoided looking him in the eye, as if they were afraid of being next. When he walked through the door for the last time, he felt something he had never felt before. A deep emptiness, as if a part of him had been ripped away without warning. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would only be the beginning of a much larger journey. A journey of pain, reflection, and ultimately, transformation. The following days were a blur of pain and confusion. David returned home, but he was no longer the same man who had left every day for 10 years with his head held high and his backpack on his back. He felt like a shadow, someone who had lost not only a job, but also his identity. For years he had defined himself by that job, by the title on his badge, by the achievements accumulated within those walls. Now, without that, who was he? That question hammered in his mind as he sat in the living room chair, staring into space, unable to find answers. His family tried to help, but he could barely talk about what he was feeling. His wife, Maria, urged him to seek help or even take some time off to rest, but David wouldn't listen. He blamed himself for everything, for the layoff, for the bills that had begun to pile up, for the sadness he saw in his daughter's eyes when she tried to cheer him up. "I failed," he repeated to himself, like a toxic mantra that echoed in his mind. At night, he could barely sleep, haunted by memories of the office, of the unfulfilled promises, and of Eduardo's cold gaze. It was as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders, and he didn't know how to lift it. But the worst part wasn't the silence. It was the noise. The phone ringing with calls from creditors, the messages from friends asking how he was doing, the sound of the news on TV talking about economic crises and unemployment. Everything seemed to conspire against him, as if the universe wanted to constantly remind him of his fragility. There were times when he thought about giving up, about giving in to that emptiness that was slowly consuming him. But then, something inside him resisted. It was a small, almost invisible flame that still shone deep in his soul. Maybe it was faith, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the determination of a man who knew he had to keep going for his family. It was in this deep darkness that David began to notice something unexpected. As he walked alone in the park near his home, looking at the fallen leaves on the ground and the gray sky above, he felt a silent presence beside him. It wasn't a person, but something bigger, something he couldn't explain, but that made him feel like he wasn't completely alone. It was there, in that moment of total vulnerability, that he began to question, could this fall be the beginning of something new? Something he had never imagined before. It was one rainy afternoon, while leafing through an old notebook he had kept for years, that David began to see something different. Amidst the scribbles and forgotten to-do lists, he found words he had written long ago, when he still dreamed big. I want to do something that really matters. I want to touch lives. Those words seemed to scream at him now, as if they were saying, "You can still do it." For the first time in weeks, he felt something other than despair, a tiny spark of curiosity. What if everything he had been through so far was just a prelude to something bigger? What if this pain, so deep and overwhelming, was actually the fuel for a new beginning? David decided to break out of his rut. He began attending support groups for people who, like him, had lost their jobs and were struggling. He didn't go as someone who knew all the answers, but as someone who needed help. And by sharing his story, he realized he was helping others too. One man, who had been laid off after 20 years in a factory, said to him, "You know, listening to you made me feel like I'm not alone in this." Those words touched David deeply. He had never thought that his pain could be turned into something useful, something that could comfort someone else. It was as if, for the first time, he was doing something that truly mattered. Over time, David began to rediscover his purpose. He realized that although corporate work had been his life for a decade, it no longer had to define him by it. He could be more. Much more. He began to dedicate hours each day to studying new areas, things he had always wanted to learn but never had the courage to do. He enrolled in online courses on mentoring and personal development, determined to use his experience to help others overcome difficult times. As he embarked on this new path, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. It was as if he had found a new reason to wake up every day, something that filled him with gratitude even in the most difficult moments. But this journey of rediscovery also brought something unexpected. As David began to build this new chapter in his life, he realized that there were still unresolved issues with his old job. It wasn't anger or a desire for revenge. It was something more subtle, like a sense that the story wasn't over yet. And then, one morning, he received news that made him stop and reflect. Something that would make him see his entire journey in a new light. With each step he took toward this new path, David began to realize that his life was no longer defined by a name tag or an office desk. He was building something much bigger, something that touched lives and created real connections. He decided to start a small online mentoring group for people who, like him, had been laid off and were lost in the emotional turmoil. It was just a simple idea at first, but it quickly took shape. He used his experiences to guide others, sharing lessons, learned from the pain and silence of those dark months. The impact was immediate and surprising. People from all over the country began signing up, bringing stories that echoed David's pain and resilience. There was Maria, a single mother who had been laid off after 15 years at a company. João, a middle-aged man who felt like his career was over. And so many others who found in Jose not just a mentor, but also a friend. He realized that although his journey had been painful, it had prepared him for something he could never have planned on his own. It was as if every obstacle along the way had been put there for a greater reason, to shape him and make him capable of helping others. But what was most impressive was how this new phase had transformed Jose internally. He stopped blaming himself for what had happened and began to see his dismissal as a gift in disguise. If I hadn't gone through this, he thought, I would never have discovered who I really am. His family noticed the change too. His daughter, who had previously seen her father exhausted and absent, now found him smiling and present. Even his wife, Maria, commented, "You seem to be alive." Again, and he knew it was true. He was being reborn, not only for himself, but for everyone around him. However, as his life was taking this new direction, something unexpected happened. An old co-worker called him, her voice hesitant. She wanted to talk about something important, something related to the company where he had dedicated so many years of his life. Jose had no idea what would happen next, but he sensed that this call would be more than just a coincidence. Perhaps it was the opportunity to close a cycle, or to open a completely unexpected chapter. The call from his former colleague brought to light something that Jose could never have foreseen. She hesitantly told him about the company's behind the scenes after his departure. It seemed that Eduardo's management had plunged the organization into an unprecedented crisis. Impulsive decisions, unbridled cuts, and a lack of strategic planning had led to a financial collapse. Employees were being laid off en masse. Important clients were abandoning the company, and rumors of bankruptcy were beginning to circulate in the market. The man who had coldly dismissed Jose was now facing questions even from shareholders. It was as if the universe had turned, revealing the consequences of Eduardo's selfish and inhumane choices. Jose listened to all this with a mixture of surprise and quiet relief. It wasn't revenge that he felt. Far from it. He had already overcome that chapter of his life and found peace in his new purpose. But there was something deeply satisfying in knowing that his suspicions were right. The company didn't value people as it should, and now he was paying the price for it. His colleague ended the conversation with a heartfelt plea. "You deserve justice, Jose. If you need references or support to sue for labor injustice, we're here." He thanked her, but knew he didn't have to go down that path. For him, the real victory had already been won. He had turned his pain into something positive, something that went beyond any financial compensation. Word about the company's crisis spread quickly, and soon other former colleagues began seeking him out, seeking advice and guidance. Jose realized that while the company was sinking under its own arrogance, he was building bridges, helping people restart their lives, finding strength where before there had been only fear. It was then that he understood the true meaning of justice. It wasn't about punishing others or having your mistakes exposed. It was about moving forward, finding your way, and proving that even in the greatest setbacks, it is possible to rise again stronger. And deep down, he knew that this was the greatest turnaround of all. As he watched the sunset from his window, Jose felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in a long time. He thought about all the sacrifices, the tears, and the lessons he had learned over the years. It had all shaped who he was today. A resilient, grateful man, ready to inspire others. He looked at his wife and daughter playing in the living room and realized that, at the end of the day, success wasn't measured by titles or salaries, but by the connections we make and the lives we touch. And with that certainty in his heart, he knew his future would be as bright as he chose to make it. David's story teaches us something profound. Sometimes the greatest falls can lead to the greatest new beginnings. He could have wallowed in anger or revenge, but he chose a different path, the path of forgiveness, resilience, and purpose. And that's exactly what we can all do when we face difficult times. No matter how unfair or painful what we are going through is, there is always an opportunity hidden there, waiting to be discovered. What about you? Have you ever experienced a situation in which you felt like everything was lost, but managed to find a new direction? Or maybe you are going through that moment right now. If that is the case, I want to remind you of something important. Your pain does not define you. It can be the fuel for a greater transformation, as it was for Jose. Life has an incredible way of surprising us when we decide to move forward with faith and gratitude. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below with what struck you the most. Also share it with someone who needs this message today. because we all know someone who is struggling in silence. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you can continue receiving real stories that will inspire your journey. Because in the end, what really matters is not the stumbles along the way, but how we choose to get up and move forward. Until the next story.